Nice to see you. I am excited to be kind of with you today. I had really hoped to be able to make it to New York to actually deliver an in-person talk for the first time in years, but I had class, so my students had needed me and I wasn't going to be able to make it. So thanks for having me and thanks for joining me. I know that some of you were coming just from class and you may have skipped lunch to join, but thanks so much for being here today. So I wanted to really introduce myself a little bit also in the context of this talk is the name of this talk is a Doomsday Optimist Guide to Surviving Uncertain Futures. And a lot of it is inspired by my love of pop culture and my love of the planet. So when I want you to know that in terms of like the way that I usually present my talks is it's mostly about life and then I bring it back to design at the end. So I'm hoping that you'll follow along with me. And if those of you that have seen me speak before, you know that I like to talk about my love of television. And so I'm going to be doing that here today, but I will definitely connect it to design. So just bear with me as we do that. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. So give me 2 seconds. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Raja. So pronouns are she, her. So happy to be here. My talk today, again, as I said, is the Doomsday Optimist Survival Guide, advice for designing in uncertain futures. And the reason I wanted to talk about this today, or really every day, is in February of 2020, I was actually a designer in residence for the Philadelphia Museum of Art exhibition, Design for Different Futures. And it's an exhibition of speculative design, which is just an exciting place to be, it's sort of as you walk through it. But my role as a designer in residence is really to sit in the Futures Therapy Lab, where people would they would go through the exhibition and they would exit through the gift shop. But before they would actually get there was like this programmatic space that was kind of like a hybrid craft table, like library with like lounging area, and then a therapist area where you could come and sort of unpack and download your thoughts on the future. And then also really discuss some of the anxieties that you may or may not have. And then in the context of the exhibition or just in general. And so for a number of weekends, I sat in a chair and people came up to me and asked me like what I did and then unloaded all their thoughts on the future. This was February of 2020. And a month later, a pandemic hit. And the things that we discussed were things that the exhibition itself made people consider in terms of things like AI and the role of robots in society and taking over jobs, but also like this lack of like privacy, thinking about like sort of like impending doom. And so the questions that we asked in the intake and outtake from this exhibit was, you know, what can rate your level of anxiety about the future? And, you know, I would say statistically speaking, just based on the people that answered when I was there, the majority of the participants were like very much anxious and felt very much out of control over what was happening in the future. And they asked me how I felt. And I would always be like, I'm optimistic. And they were like, I was like, I'm also think the world is a shit show. But as a designer, I also know that once I can identify a problem, I can start to strategize on ways to solve it. And I always have, and maybe this is a stupid and naive way of thinking, that at the very last minute, humanity is going to save ourselves. And that's my hope. But one of the ways that I really try to think about pushing that scenario is through the lens of science fiction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the very beginning, but then I try to imagine like how we've been able to survive thus far, like getting through. And so I'm going to be sharing the wisdom of Black women as we start to think about ways we might actually like get out of this one day. So that's me. Hi, I'm Raja. I'm a fan of donuts. I'm a designer. I'm also a fan of social justice and the future. And I do believe that children are the future. About 21 or 22 years ago, I taught a summer camp based on this book, The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. It was one of the first times I had the opportunity to create my own summer camp curriculum. And so I was a designer teaching at a science museum, and I really wanted students to think about ways of surviving in different biomes and habitats, and then designing structures that might help them. And so I worked with a bunch of middle schoolers, and we pretty much just took over the basement of a museum in Atlanta. And we painted murals that were supposed to represent the area, but then we really started to study a lot and try to figure out how we would survive. And so this book at the time had just come out. Are you all familiar with this? It's like in its 25th year or 20th year. People know about this book. It's amazing. Just so you know, it is very practical and very hilarious guide on how to survive everything from like sharks to like swine flu. COVID is not in there, but it should be, because it would be in this book. But thinking about how we are always returning to sort of resources to determine what are the best steps and what are the best strategies to survive under certain circumstances, right? And sometimes these are discrete things like quicksand. Like, you know, how often have you all come across quicksand in your lives, right? It's just like a rare occasion. But now it seems that some of these like worst case scenarios are becoming more and more prevalent. And that's one of the things that I think is giving a lot of anxiety over what our futures are. And also just the lack of control that we feel over the decisions that people make, especially in light of our current pandemic and circumstances. So I was thinking about how, if we look to science fiction and we look to some of the stories that are painted, there are opportunities for us to really learn from a lot of experts who have had to survive extreme situations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where I pulled this from. So I grew up in South Georgia, and I'm neurodivergent, so I have ADHD. But one of my great loves was TV, and I also had a very vivid imagination as a kid. So my favorite genre was always things that really pushed either fantastically or really future forward or like space forward. So sci-fi was like my jam. And the stories that I love the most are ones set in post-apocalyptic futures where new governments and new power structures have sort of like cemented. And then there's some heroine that's like working to save everybody, right? And if you all have not had a chance, this is from Hunger Games, just as a reference. So this is Katniss Everdeen, who was the heroine of Hunger Games, and it's set in, you know, the United States following a disaster, and new colonies have formed based on really their contribution to our industrial way of living. So from agriculture to textiles to food sources, and from the sea, from coal and energy, it's pretty much geographically divided and controlled from a central government. And that central government are your 1%ers, right? The people that have everything that they need, or living in highly technical societies. And it's not that the people that live in these colonies don't have access to technology, but the technology is used to control what they're doing. And this conversation on if we live in a world in a future where technology is still at a high level, where we can have sentient robots that are going around and monitoring people, where we can have really complex, almost prison-like communities, but we are using that power to disempower people and to traumatize people and to control people. That's where the danger comes. So it's not that the apocalypse comes and Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp shut down. It's that the apocalypse comes, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp are still there, but they're only being used by a select few, and they're only being used for misinformation and control. Like that's the fear, right? So as we're thinking about what we're creating and designing and what we value in the world, technology becomes one of those things where even in movies and books like The Hunger Games, you can see where when it's withheld and it's not equitably distributed, what that can lead to in terms of like societal makeup. And then The Expanse is probably one of my most favorite current shows that's still on. So this is Naomi Nagata, who's an engineer on the Rocinante. I won't spoil too much about this, but if you have not had a chance to see it, it's set about, I want to say 300 years, maybe 150 years in the future, not too far away. But we've gotten to the point where we've colonized the near solar system. So Mars, the asteroid belt, Moon, Luna, the Earth itself has gone through some transition in terms of the political power. And we're starting to see the emergence of not just new technologies that have afforded us to be able to do all these things, but new races of people based on literally where they live or grew up, right? So we have Martians now. We have people who were born in the asteroid belt. And we're starting to see humanity evolve, like from a biological standpoint, but also from a societal standpoint. But as we're evolving, we're also being able to see what remains, right? So there are these technological advances, there's these scientific advances, there's these amazing things that are happening. And if you look at some of like the props and prototypes from transportation to communication to all those things, the technology is there, the science is sound. That's one of the things that people always say about the Expanse is they pay a really careful attention to making sure that everything that they present is feasible and plausible and is scientifically backed in some way. But what they also are very careful to do is to also make sure that there is a believable power system and political system that's in place where you're looking at issues of inequity, of rebellion, of people's lived experiences not matching up, and starting to see where those same breakdowns can continue no matter how advanced we are or where we leave. And I think that for me, this show is a really great lesson in people are always trying to figure out how to get out of here. Like, you know, and I wanted to put Nikki Alia's song, Earth is Ghetto, I Want to Leave on here, but I forgot to do that. But there's this idea that if we could leave, we could go somewhere else and make it better. And we're always talking about like, what is it like to colonize Mars? Well, they show you in this movie, in this book series, what it's like to colonize Mars. It's really effing hard. And the people that are able to go through that have a different mindset than just someone who's just curious about Mars, right? So because of that, there becomes like this almost autocratic and very militaristic society that forms in Mars, but that's the kind of sort of discipline and rigor that you have to have in order to be able to survive in extreme circumstances when you never have access to like outside air. And so everything about this whole entire thing is painted in a way that seems very believable. And because it seems so believable, you start to ask really deep questions about the role of design and technology and engineering and all those products in facilitating some of the inequities that persist and also helping to liberate people who are in dire circumstances. And so one of my favorite shows growing up was watching Star Trek with my mom. So my mother is a Trekkie and my dad is big into Star Wars. So I just watched both of them because they were both TV and I didn't care. So my mom grew up watching this series. So the original series of Star Trek was on in the 60s. And if you're thinking about it in terms of relationship to design, the Star Trek communicator in and of itself was one of those objects that not only by virtue of it existing as a prop in this show was kind of a cool thing, its impact literally brought into being the cell phone, the flip phone, like the very first mobile phone. 9 years after seeing it on this show, people tried to make it. So the role of media and movies and TV, it's super influential into how we are picturing what tomorrow is going to look like and how we are taking inspiration from some of those things to shape our futures. But the reason I bring this particular image up is it's not just about those props. For me, it is a lot about the people. And Nichelle Nichols' character in particular is someone who is instrumental in changing the shape of the space industry and the STEM and STEAM industry as you all know it, as we all know it, in terms of who is there and who is not there. So I'm going to tell a quick story about her after I get to this other one. So I'm coming back to Nichelle in a second. But one last show about sort of like survival after the shit has hit the fan. If you all haven't seen Firefly, this is Zoe Washburn, played by Gina Torres. Gina Torres, the actor who's been in a lot of things, Suits, I think, but mostly plays science fiction roles. And I had the chance to see Gina at a con a few years ago at Dragon Con. It's a con in Atlanta that I usually go to. Con is a sci-fi convention, so sci-fi pop culture convention, because that's what I do. And I dress up in cosplay, and I actually cosplayed Zoe Washburn a couple of years ago. All right, so anyway, she talked a lot about why she loves playing science fiction roles, and why it's so important for her as a Black woman to be in this position. And mostly, to paraphrase what she said in that panel, and some of it's on the screen, is when she would audition for roles, no one would hire her for anything else. Sci-fi was one of those genres that was kind of open to anybody who wanted to, like, they could find, and especially people who were seen to be outliers. So it was like this area where suddenly, like Nichelle Nichols' character, right, with Commander Uhura, you have someone on a screen, and it's not because of their race, because they're set in a future where races are seen as different. We're talking about alien races. We're not talking about people that are racially divided based on skin color anymore. We're talking about other things. And you can see a lot of parallels in like how we define race here as a social construct based on skin tone in America, and how they're looking at it in terms of setting up some of those same parallels with different races that you see in science fiction. But this is another one where there's a role of Black women is not seen as a Black woman. So that people are being able to be cast in sort of like what they call this colorblind way, but it's not really. And this is something that Gina fell in love with. And she says that, you know, when you fall in the cracks, you have to thank God for sci-fi, because they'll give you a gun and they'll say, go over there and conquer the world. You kick some ass, girl. And so from that standpoint, the representation that you see on screen is so pivotal to how we shape the world now, because being able to visualize a career path that may be in the future, or a role for yourself, or a level of confidence in yourself, or level of ability, is so abstract for so many people. The ideas of the future are no further than a couple of hours out. In fact, if you look at the beginning of this pandemic, no one could wait 2 weeks to not go around and stop spreading things, right? We had to stay home for 2 weeks and we couldn't do it. We couldn't imagine a future where we would be A-okay if we just hung out. And so Nichelle specifically, not only because of her role on Star Trek, was able to influence women and Black boys and girls all over the world to go into the STEM field. She almost left herself because it was just a job for her, until she had a really rich conversation with Martin Luther King Jr. At a fundraising dinner for the NAACP. And he came up to her and said, I'm your biggest fan. And she was like, oh, thank you so much. You know, and I'm really gonna miss my co-stars, because she had just turned in her letter of resignation to Gene Roddenberry. And he said, you know, what are you talking about? And she goes, I told him. And then he said, you cannot. And then I'm gonna read this to you. Don't you see what this man is doing? He's referring to Gene Roddenberry, who has written this. This is the future. He has established us, meaning Black people, as we should be seen. 300 years from now, we are here. We are marching, and this is the first step. When we see you, we see ourselves. And when we see ourselves as intelligent and beautiful and proud. So the role in this is, you're thinking about this set in the 60s. This is the height of the civil rights, the civil rights movement of the 60s. I know we're talking about 2020 and 2021, continuing that on, but this is where people are fighting for dignity, where you have people marching around saying that I am a man, right? Where you have people being attacked by dogs and fire hoses. being beaten and imprisoned. And here's this woman who has this role on a television show, and the weight and gravity of that hadn't really sunk in with her until this conversation. And so she said that she went back and told Gene that she was staying. He had already ripped up the resignation letter, and she said she's never looked back. And in fact, she leaned into it more and started working very closely with NASA to specifically recruit more women and Black boys and girls into the STEM field. So the reason we can look at people like Mae Jemison and so many other Black and women astronauts is because of Nichelle. This was an intentional move on her part. And this moving with intentionality is something we always see, I would say, with Black women. And it's because of our position in the world. And so this is where I'm transitioning the talk into sort of like thinking about how we might survive through the wisdom of Black women. And also I'm going to bring in some Indigenous knowledge too in a little bit. And it's because of our role in the world as sort of like these victims of racism. And so as we think about the role of racism as it relates to just lived experiences, is it something that if you are someone who lives in a country where your race is seen as inferior, and here in the United States, as a Black person, that's me, right? And for those of you that are of other racial groups, then that might be you too. I can't really see who's in the audience. But the function of racism is it distracts you from being your full selves, from being able to be productive, for being able to contribute in the ways that you want to, right? And you're always trying to prove your worth and your dignity. And when that's something that's weighing in the back of your head every day when you wake up, there's a trauma that exists there, but there's also a problem to be solved. And so there's always this sort of like deep pull to try to improve society. And I see this time and time and again, and I know that we can say that so many different people contribute, but whenever I think about people that like, I just want to stand up and shout about, I always seem to see a Black woman sort of at the center of the conversations. And so I was thinking that I would pull together this talk for us to think about ways to be optimistic and to leverage our identities to survive the future, and thinking about how Black women have continued to do this over and over and over again. So the Toni Morrison quote is something that I try to bring up regularly because I try to remind people that are tired of talking about race that if you live in a social construct that identifies you as a racial other, you're tired of talking about it too, but you can't get away from it. It's every day, right? So we can't just say, I'm tired of talking about it. It's something we always have to be doing, but how do we use our position to think about ways to solve the world? And so there's two authors that I'm going to start referencing. Octavia Butler, who is a science fiction writer, wrote Parable the Sower, talk to you a little bit about that. And then Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, which brings together so many amazing things, but it really is based on the work of Octavia Butler. So Octavia Butler was a science fiction writer, prolific, probably one of the most important women science fiction writers of the late 20th century. She died in the mid-2000s, the aughts, way ahead of her time. But she is probably one of the most well-known and influential science fiction writers. And one of the hallmarks of the works that she wrote was they centered Black women or Black non-binary characters and futures in space, traveling through time, right? So there was a science fiction layer, but it was always set in a probable, almost historical fiction-like setting and sometimes. And one of those settings that she wrote about was 2024. So about 30 years ago, she wrote about that. And when you write, if you were to read the book now, Parable of the Sower, it literally is like you're reading a newspaper article that talks about climate change, it talks about resilience. It even hints at the role of factory towns or like mill towns. And for those of you that don't know about like the history of America, a lot of our industrial practices, when they were based on the unpaid labor of enslaved people, when we converted to having to pay people for their labor in the Reconstruction, people did not want to do that. And so in order to do that, we had almost indentured servitude where you could live and work on someone's property, but you never made enough to actually leave, and you ended up being in debt to your bosses, right? And so doing this on the agricultural standpoint, you can see people living, sort of like staying on the plantations that they were like enslaved on, but never really leaving and still dying there and never making enough money and always being in debt and owing money. So it's the same, it's still slavery. But then as more industrial facilities started popping up, everything from like coal mines to cotton mills and textile mills, in order to keep the workers close by, the companies would build affordable, lower class mill town villages around the property. And you lived and you worked at work. And we start to see that happening also with like our current places like Apple computers, right? I don't know if you guys know this, but if you work for Apple, they actually have the equivalent. They have company housing where you stay and you work at Apple, or companies even like Pixar, where they used to incentivize so much their workers to stay, they would give them stipends to like fix up their offices in the evening. So the parable of the sower not only talks about climate change and pandemics and all these things that are like very traumatic, but it also very prescient right now, but it also talks about things that we may be not as conscientious of that are kind of getting an inkling going. Even opioid crisis is in there. So one of the things that comes from that is all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. And the only lasting truth is change. God is change. So we're in a moment at a pivot point where the world is changing in this book for the characters there, and something happens and they have to survive. And there's all these things that they rely on, but the main crux of it comes from these strategies that Adrienne Maree Brown has pulled out from the text that comes from Octavia Butler's work. And that is looking at life, successful life as fractal, being adaptable, being opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, fecund, understanding, use it, and shape God. So Octavia's words on the left in the italices, and then on the right are the strategies. So thinking about how things can grow and become a network, how we can adapt, being iterative as opposed to linear, being transformative and resilient, also decentralizing things. So interconnectedness is a community thing, but it's also a very natural thing. Being fecund is always looking for these other opportunities, being reflective of what we're doing, practicing and experimenting, and then working with intention. So Adrienne Maree Brown is a scholar activist, a pleasure activist, environmentalist, community organizer based in Detroit. And their work is just transformative for me, having read Emergent Strategies and Pleasure Activism. But it really is about setting up these strategies about how we can intentionally change in ways and grow in our capacity to embody just and liberated worlds, right? So these emergent strategies are all about that. And she pulls from a number of different things. So Janine Benes's work with biomimicry, for those of you that know bio-inspired design or biomimicry, which is really looking at how we can mimic natural systems to create better things, and trying to see how nature has solved a problem and then working in the same, doing the same functions and structures and behaviors as nature to sort of mimic that same aptitude. So not necessarily just copying the forms and shapes, but it really is looking at what problem nature solved. How can I solve a problem similar to that? And then how do I do it in the same efficient way that nature does it? Not just sort of like in a similar way, because when we think about some of the best and most efficient and resilient and adaptive and fractal like things, it really is looking at our ecosystem, our natural world. And then also looking for a way for us to practice seeing the future together, right? And that's the other thing about emergent strategies is once we pull these things together and we embrace this idea of change, then we're not afraid of it and we can be optimistic about it, because if we're co-creating it together, it becomes something that could be joyous and liberating for all of us. And what I love about emergent strategies is it pulls from so many great scholars, mostly women and non-binary folks, but looking at relationships, looking at understanding how to navigate chaos, sharing of information, organizational change, and then really thinking about how our relationships bring us together. And we talk about this so much with the relationship with design and community, or co-designing, or empathy, right? We are in this together, but moving intentionally through that, it's a much slower pace than the way that we're doing it when we just interview someone, so that we got what we needed, and then operate from there, right? So it really has to be a collective effort where everyone is included and everyone is empowered. And the reason that science fiction has been so great is it also allows us to practice this future together. So it's not just the strategies that we're applying, but we can practice how we want to be in the future. So justice is something we can practice together. We can think about our own responsibility based on our own lived experiences. And then it really is about sparking the imagination of people to envision alternatives to the way that we live currently. And I like to play with both ends of this, the dystopian and the utopian visions, because one of the things that I don't think we dwell enough in is how bad things can get. Even though we can look across the globe and see the worst of the worst, I think it's a trauma response to be able to block those things out and to continue to operate, because it's not you. Like, you can live in a house and next door to you, the house burns down and you do nothing. I mean, you feel bad for the people, but your house is okay. So you're kind of like, whew, I missed that, right? And it's like we could empathize, but it's like something is protecting us from doing that. And obviously not everyone is able to sort of separate that or dissociate in that way. But I think if you look across the globe, we are able to do that. So as long as it's not affecting us, it doesn't kind of matter. And once we push through these really extreme scenarios where people start to be able to see themselves in the worst possible circumstances, that's when people are more motivated to change, when there's a risk factor to them. And so when I look at science fiction, I like to not just go for the utopic, even though I am an optimist. I like to dwell in the dystopic because it's a motivator for me, because it's a problem that needs to be solved. So when I think about tying this to Indigenous design as well, there's a couple more strategies to think about. It's community over self. You're thinking about things 7 generations ahead. Every action that you do, of course, like, you know, everything that you do is change, right? And everything that you change changes you, that you touch. So you're going to be touching things in your interactions with people, in the work that you're doing, in the designs that you're interacting with. And so the question is, how is this impacting me today? Who do I become by designing something? Should this exist? And if it should exist, how will it impact not me today, not tomorrow, not my kids, not my grandkids, but how will it affect people 7 generations from now, right? Because when we talk about the future, we can't just stop thinking 2 weeks, next week, this weekend, tomorrow. We really have to push much further out and start to really do some scenario forecasting. And then I'm going to be pulling in a few more quotes from some amazing Black women, and just so I can sort of pull this together for you, and then I'm going to show you a little bit more about my work. So thinking about this idea of generations and ancestors, this idea of, you've heard Michelle Obama say that I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. And if you don't remember that, she did say that. But for me, it's like, I don't even know that if my ancestors had the wherewithal to even imagine a world like it is today. I couldn't even imagine today, a year and a half ago. I thought we would be in much better circumstances. In fact, I couldn't imagine today, 43 years ago, when I was a kid, when I thought that the Save the Whales movement, the Save the Rainforest movement, and the World Peace movement, I had peace signs on everything. Like I was that kid. I was like, oh, we're gonna save it. We're gonna save it. Everybody's gonna be like flying on air, and nobody's gonna be driving a gas guzzling car anymore. And here we are. It's still this. It's more of the same. In fact, it's worse, right? So I think that we need to imagine we're fighting for people that we're never going to meet. And what kind of world do we want to leave them? And it really is about us coming together. And especially if you don't find yourself in a vulnerable group who was being affected by some of the impacts of climate change as much as others, because climate change It's affecting all of us, but it really is disproportionately impacting impoverished communities of color globally. And so that's something we all have to be aware of, that the work that we're doing as designers, designing especially hardware, garments, and transporting goods, that everything about that has some potential impact on the ecosystems in which we're pulling resources, creating things, distributing things, and then looking at the quality of those goods as well. So a lot of times people think of sort of helping other people who are vulnerable as this sort of like charitable thing, like I'll help you because I'm in a better position, but it really does impact all of us. And it really has to be about a collective effort. And then one of the things that I think is really important is when we start to see when things get really bad, is we have this idea of like, who's gonna save us? Like, like things are horrible. How are we gonna like fix this? And if you guys remember the 2016 election and the 2020 election, depending, I don't know who even cares what political side you were on. There was a lot of anxiety over how we were going to like get by the skin of our teeth, right? And this happens time and time again, where there's like some sort of like election that is like very, very close. And then they count up the votes and it's like overwhelmingly statistically, when you break it down, like in terms of like who voted in, I guess, the most, I don't know, monogamous group of voters. Again, like homogenous. It's black voters. We vote in our own self-interest. And we do it to the 97%. Like there's very few of us that divert from that. And has nothing to do with saving the world. It has to do with us being in a position of vulnerability and wanting to go literally with the least evil person who is going to help empower us. Ideally, we want to be with someone who's going to empower us. And the thing is, when Black people win, everybody benefits because of our position, especially in the United States. You know, we're in a position that's far more vulnerable than many other people. So it's one of those things where if we start to think about not just the idea of like Black people in voting is sort of like in a monolith, because it's not that we are a monolith. It's this idea of us really pushing for freedom, because we've been for 400 years, especially Black people in America, in a position of such a low status. And so we can thank one person, like for a lot of the things that have happened in the last year, is Stacey Abrams, who lost the gubernatorial election in Georgia 6 years ago. But because of that, was catalyzed to really help to enfranchise voters of all backgrounds in a state where they were literally trying to rip the vote from people. And bringing it back to this, why Black women in particular are so amazing. And I'm not just saying that because I am one, but it's because when you're underestimated all the time, all you do is step up to the bat and like knock it out of the park. And it's one of those things from a societal expectation, is this double minority with being a person of color and a woman, means that people's perception and expectation of you and treatment of you for your entire life is going to be one of second guessing and almost undermining. And so what we find is Black women in particular work super, super hard just to be recognized at the same level as someone who's kind of like phoning it in. And there's like there's quotes that are out there, but it pretty much says that we want to be treated the same as like a mediocre white guy. In order to do that, we have to work, 3 times as hard in order to accomplish those things. And so when we start to think about like how this has impacted our globe, there's so many people out there who are changing our present society. Antoinette, who is a design ethicist or an AI ethicist, left Google, a pretty big deal not too long ago. I have no idea if you guys know who this is. If you don't, she was fired, and she was fired because she was trying to publish a paper on AI ethics that would have painted Google's efforts in a real light. I wouldn't say a bad light. It was just exposing there's a lot of bias in artificial intelligence. which there is. It's like not a thing. And was talking about how there really needs to be a lot more intersectional focus on this, because even the big companies that have these ethics departments, of which she was one, aren't getting it right? So there needs to be a lot more oversight, a lot more inclusion. And this paper was supposed to be going off to a conference, and suddenly Google needed to review it to make sure it was acceptable to go to a conference, which they had never done before. And the pushback from that led to 10 minutes exit. But amazing in terms of focusing on bias as it relates to design and gender, artificial intelligence and race and gender, all those things. But it's holistic. So it's not just about the technology and those things, it's looking at everything. So how we think about equity from the standpoint of race and gender also has to do with how we think about our role in the environment. Because again, once you are in a vulnerable population, you're vulnerable everywhere. And so it's about that sort of like full experience, like as a person in the world, but it's also thinking about this idea of discrimination through the things that we're designing, through technology. And that's where we start to see these things like at their height in science fiction, like when these things are really working, and then start to ask even more questions. Right now, the questions we're asking largely have to do with like, does this work good enough for what we're trying to do? And how do we make it work better? But if you push it far enough, you kind of wonder if it should have existed at all. And then Joy Weenie, if you don't know, her work is it's an MIT Media Lab, also a design ethicist and researcher activist, really focusing on artificial intelligence and design and bias as it relates to everything from policing to healthcare to all those things. And largely started her work sort of dissecting facial recognition patterns because she wanted to work with AI and wanted to work with facial recognition, but it wouldn't recognize her face. And so she's been having to use like this white mask. And so she started to think about this, the poor models in which machine learning and artificial intelligence models are fed. It's largely white men. So it has trouble recognizing women's faces and people of color's faces, to the point where it doesn't just like misgender, or because gender presentation can vary, right? It doesn't just misgender or like miss whatever. It like gets it so wrong that you can have like Michelle Obama sitting there and it says that she's like a young man that has like a criminal record that they found, and it's a match, and they're pretty confident about it, right? So there's a lot of, it's not just that it's a little bit wrong, we want to kind of make it better in terms of like troubleshooting, it's irresponsibly wrong, right? It's bad. And so what she really pushes for is this role of inclusion. So how do we make sure that our systems are much more inclusive, so that it's not just, we have more precision in the work that we're doing, but also realizing that maybe we should not be using it all the time. So like, how do we create these systems and pull ourselves back from using them at all costs, so that we can be respectful of people's actual lives and choices and privacy, and things aren't thrust upon them. And this is related to dignity. And I would say that dignity is a huge part of like what the justice movement is doing. It's a huge part of what you see Indigenous design doing. It's a huge part of what you're seeing feminist design doing. It's a huge part of what you're seeing like Afrofuturists doing, as well as Joy and Liberation. It really is about making sure that people feel seen, whole, and heard. And it's one of the things that we forget about as we're thinking about design. We're always thinking about solving problems, but we never think about the way in which we're doing it is about not just bringing about happiness and peace, but it is about bringing dignity to people. And Ida B. Wells also has this amazing quote, journalist, scholar, teacher from 100-something years ago. But it really is about like, how much are you willing to accept in terms of injustice, especially when we have these like oppressive systems and these things that are like non-equitable. And it's about this ability to fight for things. But for me, it's about being able to balance that, because you can be at the top of your game and want to do so much and contribute so much, but it's exhausting, right? And one of the people that I just fell in love with this past year, I mean, I've always been a big fan of the Olympics and gymnastics, but Simone Biles sat out most of the gymnastic rounds at the Olympics in Japan just a few months ago. And it was a focus on our mental health. It's just stressed out. We're living in a pandemic, right? And in order to be able to rise up and fight for injustices, we have to prioritize our mental health in order to do that. And so there is this fine balance, because there is a lot of emotional labor and trauma that goes into fighting for your own existence, or fighting for someone else's existence as well. And it's one of those things where you can be the best in the world, and it's okay to sort of like take a break. I always joke with some of my Black students that, you know, whenever something's going on in the news, I'll email them and I'll be like, you guys want to take a day off of being Black today and stay home? You don't have to come to class. They always laugh and come anyway, saying they appreciate it. But I'm dead serious when I send that email, because I don't want to make my students feel like that I'm not acknowledging the impact and trauma of what's happening in the world day to day. And I've been trying to just push ownership of mental health to all my students. But when we're well rested, we make better decisions. And I do think a well-rested designer is going to be a better designer at the end of the day. And sort of wrapping up my Black women's quotes, but Nikki Giovanni is also an amazing person. I met her 20 years ago when I was an undergraduate student at Georgia Tech. She signed a couple of my books. It was so amazing. But this quote, I think, is really important in terms of like, there's always something to do. So some people are always wondering, like, you know, what can I do to make a difference in the world? And, you know, we've been talking a lot about race and talking a lot about gender. And it's not so much that all of these women are only fighting on behalf of their own race or gender. They're always fighting on behalf of humanity. So I want to make sure that's clear. If a Black woman steps up to the plate because something is wrong, it's because it's not just wrong for her. That must mean it's wrong for a lot of other people too, because we get all of it. So if we solve one of our problems, we're solving somebody else's problems. And we know that. So when we're looking at these things, we're trying to understand how solving problems from a social standpoint, whether that be through the design, through policy, through action, through advocacy, is going to help everybody. So everything is potential. Everything's an opportunity. Everything's an opportunity for designers to make a difference with their voice, with their actions, with their energy, including making sure people are well, fed, clothed, sheltered, right? And then making sure that we're moving towards happiness and thinking about how we can create a visionary future together, right? And again, it's about moving away from undignified situations and moving to more hopeful and joyous ones. So for me, the way that I've been doing this as a designer is I've really been connecting my lived experiences and my values and my design skills across these three pillars: the environment, education, and equity. And the environment is because it's everything. It's where we all live. It's where everything lives. We only have one Earth. There's no planet B. There's Earth 2. If anybody's from the late 90s, remember Earth 2? There was a TV show called Earth 2. There was another Earth. Education is our pathway forward. Without it, we are not going to be able to actually navigate these things. And then everything we do must be equitable. So the power distribution has to be equitable so that everyone has access to it. So we're looking at power and agency, we're looking at racial justice, gender equity, health, and it really is moving towards liberation. And then under the education thing, it's not just exposure and access, which are really important. It's about developing critical thinkers through education so that people understand ways to solve their own problems and to liberate themselves. And then on the environmental standpoint, we're looking at biological systems, looking at circular design, being willing to go dystopic, and then also envision an ecotopic future. So I do this through a couple of different projects. One is called Digital Naturalism. I've done this for a couple of times. It's a field biology with technology and digital media and design. And we go to remote places in the world and we look at extreme ecosystems and we figure out ways to solve problems. And so I do this from the lens of education. So I try to work with young kids to figure out ways to get them to fall in love or understand and appreciate nature by trying to do biomimicry with it, by doing environmental art. But it really is about becoming stewards of the earth and then connecting that to the skill sets of design and technology by introducing them to new tools. So like I work a lot with little bits. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these. One of my students was one of the employees when it was a startup, Crystal Persaud, she became their director of design. And so I remember the first summer she was there, she came back and she was like, I work for this company called Little Bits, you got to use these. And I just like never fallen in love, but they're a magnetic electronic system, really easy to prototype, really easy to throw in a suitcase and take to Thailand. And so I worked with a school that was there, and we started looking at ways to measure nature and try to do some activities with citizen science and to do some biomimicry. It's fun, it's a fun workshop. So that turned into a project that I did here in Philadelphia. I live in Philadelphia. I live on the land of the Lenape people. And we work with students in the Northern Philly area who are predominantly Latinx. In fact, all the students that we work with were 100% Latinx. And so we're working with them with our Schuylkill Environmental Center, which Schuylkill stands for the river that runs through Philly. And so we worked with them, with their land stewardship managers, with their environmental educators, environmental artists and programmers to think about ways to solve problems for the Schuylkill Center using bio-inspired design and Little Bits. And so we're in a couple of workshops with educators, with high schoolers and with middle schoolers. And it was a lot of fun, but it was a way to connect this like field experience that I'd been able to test out abroad and bring it back here. And again, we were not just looking at an after-school program to keep people busy. It was the environmental portion, but it was also inspiring new and novel careers around problem solving, design, and engineering that these students hadn't really thought about before. At the beginning of the workshops, a lot of the students were like, I'm going to be a fireman, I'm going to be a police person, I'm going to be jobs that I can see, right? And so this role of representation, again, remember Nichelle Nichols' story, her existing on screen and inspired a whole generation of people to realize that they could be in space too. This idea of exposing people, not just to the thing, but like the jobs. It's not just to learn the skill because you're learning in school, it's to understand how that connects to like what you want to do and how you want to impact the world, and leveraging a technology early on so you're literate in it. So by the time it becomes an option for you as you're choosing a career path, post high school, then you can make the choice that you want to make and feel like you're an equitable contributor to that field and not just waiting for someone who owns that field to hire you. And then the other program that I do, and I have another one too, is called Black Girls Singing Through Dance. And so we're in our 5th year now. Actually, I need to change the screenshot because I have the wrong one up. But BGSD is really focused on doing the same thing that I was talking about with the students in North Philly, but we do it with Black girls. And me being a Black girl, I work with a team of 3 other Black women faculty here at Drexel University. We have a Black PhD student. We have Black undergraduate research assistants who all identify as women. And what we do is we teach elementary school kids and some middle school kids to code and to create e-textiles and retie it to the culturally sustaining pedagogy of dance, which is something that is culturally embedded in the Black community, but it's also an entry point to get students who maybe don't necessarily identify as someone who's into STEAM or into STEM, who don't really know what that is, they want to come and dance, perform. So we're like, well, hey, while you're here, we're going to like make AR environments and we're going to create light up costumes and interactive costumes, and they just get right into it. And so we have kids as young as like 7 years old. They're like coding and creating e-textiles, and they get really excited about the power of it. And like, they can't get enough of it. And that's something that for me, as a young kid who's always interested in technology, who's always interested in the future, I did do a lot of tinkering and taking things apart, never really put them back together. But I always wanted to know, like, how does it go back together, right? And it took until I was in high school to learn that lesson. But if we teach this early on, suddenly the girls don't even see a separation between disciplines. They don't see it as coding or design or whatever. They see it as one comprehensive thing, and they're thinking about all these things sort of in tandem. And that really is the way that the world is shaping up as we experience it, is there's not just like fashion design versus product design, versus UX. It's our dress, right? This is what I'm wearing, and it's all one thing. And so we can really think more intersectionally about the disciplines, but also intersectionally about how identity can you can leverage identity to get people who aren't always tied into some of these career paths into them. So that's the end of my talk. So really, it's really a matter of listening to Black women because they know what they're talking about. There are also really amazing books and lectures out there from a number of people that I highlighted in my talk. And I feel like all the parallels can be tied into our practice as designers as we're thinking about how we move forward in the world, and especially once you are into a professional career, if you are moving into a professional career, if you're also interested in being an advocate or an activist in your own work outside of your career and outside of just the work that you're doing, there's always ways to help and sort of improve the human condition by making sure that we have the least amount of harm and we have the most amount of dignity, joy, and optimism. So that's it, all done.